5 Messerschmitt fighters circle above him like wolves scenting blood in the air. The engine of his P-47 Thunderbolt screams at full throttle. The propeller bites into the thin air at 18,000 feet, vibrating through the cockpit. His wingmen are gone, scattered somewhere behind him in the chaos of a broken formation. He is 23 years old, alone, and the pilots in his squadron once joked that he thought too much to survive in a fighter. Now thinking is the only thing keeping him alive. Above him, the German fighters circle patiently, climbing into position for their attack. They know exactly what they are doing. They have altitude, numbers, and experience. The geometry of the fight is already against him, unless he changes the equation. Spring, 1943. The air war over Europe has become a brutal mathematical problem that no one seems able to solve. American bomber crews flying out of England face losses so severe that statisticians quietly stop calculating survival probabilities. For every 100 airmen who arrive in England, projections suggest 30 will never return home. Each mission raises the odds of dying. By the 10th sortie, survival begins to feel less likely than a coin landing on its edge. Fighter escorts try to protect the bombers, but the Luftwaffe knows its own sky. German pilots have been fighting since the early days of the war. Many have hundreds of combat hours. They know what hesitation looks like in a turn, what fear looks like in a climb, and they exploit both without mercy. The American P-47 Thunderbolt is one of the most powerful fighters in the world. It is heavy, armored, and brutally fast in a dive. But in a turning dogfight, it becomes something else entirely. A disadvantage. Against it fly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, lighter aircraft that climb quickly and turn tighter at altitude. German tactics are elegant in their simplicity. Force the American fighters into horizontal turning battles, then trap them in tightening spirals the Thunderbolt cannot win. American pilots know this. They learn it in training. They hear it repeated in every briefing. Never turn with a 109. Everyone understands the rule. And still men die. The 56th Fighter Group, flying from muddy airfields in England, escorts bombers deep into occupied Europe. Its pilots are young. Some studied engineering. Some came straight from farms and small towns. All of them have watched friends tumble out of the sky trailing smoke. Among them is one pilot who does not quite fit the mold. Not because he is braver, not because he is faster, but because before he ever touched a fighter aircraft, he spent years studying physics. His name is Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson. Half the squadron calls him Classroom Kid, not as a compliment. Johnson asks questions during briefings. Too many questions. He sketches diagrams in the margins of mission notes while other pilots are writing letters home or relaxing in the mess hall. He calculates angles of attack, relative speeds, and intercept paths. To many pilots this seems ridiculous. Fighter combat, they believe, is instinct. Reflex. Aggression. You either feel the fight or you don't. But mathematics does not care about instinct. And geometry never lies. Robert Johnson grew up in Lawton, Oklahoma, a place of dust storms, hard ground, and practical people. Machines were repaired, not replaced. If something broke, you fixed it. Johnson liked working with tools, but he liked understanding how things worked even more. At Cameron Junior College, he studied engineering and physics. Not abstract equations, but the kind of physics you could see in everyday life. How wings generate lift. How gravity accelerates objects. How velocity changes when drag and mass interact. One day, a professor demonstrated projectile motion in a simple way. He dropped a wrench and a marble from shoulder height. Both hit the floor at the same moment. Gravity, the professor explained, accelerates objects equally regardless of their mass. Johnson never forgot that demonstration. Years later, thousands of feet above Europe, that memory would return. When the United States entered the war, Johnson joined the Army Air Forces. Not because he was chasing adventure, because aircraft made sense to him. Thrust, drag, lift, weight. Everything in flight followed rules. And if you understood the rules, you might survive. Flight training proved harder than he expected. Johnson was precise, but not naturally aggressive. Instructors noted that he often thought through maneuvers before executing them. In combat, they warned, hesitation could be fatal. There would be no time to calculate. Still, he graduated and was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group. When he arrived in England in early 1943, The veterans looked him over quickly. Young, quiet, polite, probably wouldn't last long. His first combat missions were uneventful. He stayed in formation. He followed his leader. He returned safely, but he scored no victories. Other pilots sometimes shot down enemy aircraft within their first few missions. Johnson came home with empty guns and a notebook filled with sketches. The squadron teased him. "What are you drawing now, Professor?" "Flight paths," Johnson answered calmly. "Relative velocities in a dive." The pilots laughed, not cruelly, but with the easy confidence of men who trusted instinct more than calculations. One pilot told him bluntly to stop thinking and start shooting. Another said the sky wasn't a classroom. Johnson nodded politely. He did not argue, but he kept sketching, because during those missions he had begun to notice something. A pattern. German fighter attacks were not random. They followed predictable geometry. And if something follows geometry, it can be predicted, maybe even exploited. Johnson began wondering whether the same attack pattern German pilots relied on could be turned against them. But testing that idea would require something dangerous. Flying alone, at 400 miles per hour, with his life as the experiment. The central problem American fighters faced was altitude. German pilots almost always started higher. They waited above the bomber formations, hidden by sunlight or thin cloud layers. Then they dove. By the time American escorts spotted them, the energy advantage was already decisive. Climb to meet them and you lost speed. Turn to evade and they turned tighter. Dive away and they followed faster. The manual offered one grim warning. Do not dive unless you already have separation. Otherwise you are simply dying in a straight line. But Johnson kept thinking about that marble and that wrench. Gravity accelerates all objects equally, but air resistance changes the outcome. At high altitude the air is thin. A heavier aircraft diving vertically experiences less drag relative to its mass. And the P-47 Thunderbolt was very heavy. Fully loaded, it weighed more than 7 tons. A Messerschmitt 109 weighed barely half that. On paper, the math suggested something surprising. In a steep dive, the Thunderbolt should accelerate faster than any German fighter. Not because of its engine, because of physics. Johnson studied aircraft performance charts. He reviewed engineering data. He drew velocity curves again and again. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. The P-47 could outdive anything in the sky, but only if the pilot committed to a nearly vertical descent long enough for gravity to take control. And no pilot dared attempt that in combat. A vertical dive was terrifying. The airspeed indicator would slam toward the red line. The controls would stiffen. The aircraft could tear itself apart. Pull out too late, and you hit the ground. Pull out too early, and the enemy fighter behind you simply opened fire. It was the kind of maneuver pilots avoided instinctively, which meant the tactic remained only a theory. Interesting on paper, deadly in practice. And for months, it stayed that way. Until one day the sky gave Robert Johnson no other choice. For months the idea stayed locked inside Robert Johnson's notebook. A theory, interesting on paper, suicidal in the sky. He mentioned it once during a briefing, carefully, almost apologetically. A steep vertical dive, he suggested, might create enough separation to escape superior numbers. The operations officer listened politely. Then he explained, in the calm voice of experience, that such a dive would push the aircraft beyond safe limits. Airspeed would exceed the red line. Controls would stiffen. A pilot might black out before pulling out. Translation, you would kill yourself. Johnson accepted the verdict. He closed the notebook and kept flying. But the losses continued. Good pilots. Careful pilots. Men who followed the manual and still vanished in spirals of smoke because the manual could not account for every situation. Johnson watched the numbers grow worse. Every empty bunk in the barracks felt like a subtraction in a grim equation. And quietly, he kept thinking. June 26, 1943. The mission begins like many others. Escort bombers across occupied France. The sky is hazy, visibility fading in and out through thin clouds. Below them stretches the long formation of B-17s, dozens of aluminum giants crawling steadily toward their target. They look slow and vulnerable from above. A parade of aircraft waiting to be attacked. The 56th Fighter Group flies top cover, weaving back and forth above the bombers. Pilots scan the sky constantly, turning their heads until their necks ache. Johnson flies his Thunderbolt, Penrod, and Sam, the name painted beneath the canopy in white letters. He has flown this aircraft for 2 months now. He knows the feel of the controls at cruising speed. He knows how the engine vibrates when it begins to overheat. He knows the exact pressure required to roll into a dive. The radio is quiet. Too quiet. Then the warning comes. Bandits. Hi. 8 o'clock. Johnson twists in his seat and searches the pale sky. At first he sees nothing. Then he catches the faint glint of sunlight on metal. Tiny specks. The specks grow larger. And suddenly they are no longer specks. They are fighters diving out of the sun. Focke-Wulf 190s. The formation explodes into motion. Thunderbolts scatter, diving and climbing to intercept the attackers. Contrails twist across the sky like tangled ropes. Tracer fire flashes bright red in the thin air. Johnson pulls hard on the stick, trying to stay with his element leader. The G-force slams him back into his seat. His vision narrows into a gray tunnel. He blinks and forces himself to breathe. When his vision clears, the sky has changed. His leader is gone. Johnson scans the air desperately. Left, right, above, nothing. For a moment, he hopes his leader slipped beneath the clouds. Then instinct tells him to look behind. He turns his head slowly, and his stomach tightens. 5 fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. They are climbing toward him in a loose formation, spreading slightly as they approach. Not rushing, not panicking. They know they have the advantage. 1 American fighter alone against 5 German interceptors. The outcome should already be decided. Johnson's heart pounds inside his chest. His gloves are slick with sweat. He forces himself to think. Climb? Impossible. They already hold the altitude. Turn? Suicide. The Thunderbolt cannot outturn them. Run straight and level? They will close the distance and tear him apart. The manual says to call for help and evade until support arrives. But the radio is chaos. Every other American pilot is already fighting for his own life. No one is coming. Johnson exhales slowly. Then something strange happens. The fear fades. Not completely, but enough. Because the moment suddenly becomes familiar. A problem. And problems have solutions. He remembers the diagrams in his notebook. The marble. The wrench. Gravity accelerating objects equally. But mass changing how air resistance affects them. And suddenly Johnson realizes something. He has one advantage the Germans do not. Wait. He rolls the Thunderbolt upside down. The horizon flips. The earth hangs above him like a distant ceiling. Then Johnson pushes the control stick forward. Hard. The nose drops. The Thunderbolt begins to fall. Not a shallow dive. Not a combat descent. A vertical plunge. The altimeter unwinds rapidly. The airspeed indicator climbs. 300 knots. The engine roars. The aircraft trembles as gravity drags it downward. Wind begins to howl past the canopy. 350 knots. The vibration grows violent. Johnson's teeth rattle from the turbulence. The control stick feels heavier in his hands. The Thunderbolt was not designed for this. For 100 knots. The sound becomes a scream. Air pounds against the aircraft like a hurricane. Johnson's vision blurs as the landscape rushes toward him. Still he holds the dive. 450 knots. The needle edges toward the red line. Beyond that speed, the engineers cannot promise anything. Control surfaces might fail. A wing could tear free. But if he pulls out now, the Messerschmitts will still be behind him. Johnson risks a glance backward. They followed him. All 5. Their noses pointed downward, cannons ready. They expect him to level out. They expect panic. They expect the same mistakes every other American pilot has made. Johnson does not level out. Instead, he pushes the dive steeper. 70 degrees. 80. Almost straight down. The ground swells rapidly in the windshield. Fields. Roads. Farmhouses. Details he should never see this clearly from this altitude. The Messerschmitts keep following. But something begins to change. Their formation stretches. Their spacing widens. Their dive angles grow shallower. German pilots are accustomed to chasing targets diving at 50 or 60 degrees. Targets that eventually level out. Targets that run. This is something different. This is not flight. This is free fall. And the Thunderbolt, heavy, massive, unstoppable, is accelerating faster than they are. For 170 knots. Johnson can barely move the controls. The stick feels welded in place. His arms tremble with the strain. Sweat burns his eyes, but he cannot wipe it away. Both hands remain locked on the stick. The earth continues rushing upward. And somewhere behind him, 5 German pilots begin to realize something is wrong. Very wrong. The Messerschmitts are lighter aircraft. In a turning fight, that is an advantage. In a vertical dive, it becomes a weakness. Drag increases with speed, but inertia increases with mass. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighs nearly twice as much as the fighters chasing it. And when gravity takes over, mass matters. The Thunderbolt is a heavy machine. Almost 7 tons of metal and fuel and ammunition. And heavy objects fall fast. Physics does not argue. It does not negotiate. It simply works. The altimeter is unwinding like a broken clock. 15,000 feet. The ground is rushing upward now. Fields that once looked like tiny squares have become shapes with edges. Roads begin to appear like threads across the countryside. Johnson keeps the nose down. Not yet. If he pulls out too early, the Messerschmitts will still have enough speed to close the distance. If he pulls too late, he will never pull at all. 12,000 feet. Johnson glances back again. The German fighters are still there. But something has changed. They are falling behind. Not dramatically, but enough. Their spacing widens slightly. Their dive angles flatten just a little. The German pilots are experienced, but they are still human. The human body does not like plunging almost straight toward the Earth at nearly 500 miles per hour. Instinct fights against it. Physics does not. The altimeter continues spinning. 10,000 feet. Johnson's eyes flick between the ground and his instruments. Now he can see details. A farmhouse. A road. A cluster of trees. The Earth is no longer distant. It is rising to meet him. 8,000 feet. Time. Johnson begins the pull. Not a sudden jerk. A steady, deliberate pull on the control stick. The Thunderbolt resists. The controls feel like they are set in concrete. Johnson grips the stick with both hands. His shoulders tighten. His arms strain. The nose begins to rise. 1 degree. 2. 5. The G-forces hit instantly. His body slams into the seat harness. The weight of his own body multiplies until breathing becomes difficult. The edges of his vision turn gray. The world narrows into a tunnel. Johnson grunts and tightens every muscle he has, forcing blood back into his brain. The aircraft groans as the wings bite into the air. The horizon tilts. The ground slides away. 6,000 feet. The Thunderbolt levels, then slowly begins to climb. Johnson gasps for air. His lungs burn. His hands tremble on the stick. But the engine is still running. The wings are still attached. And the aircraft is climbing. He looks behind him. The Messerschmitts are gone. Not destroyed. Not crashed. Simply gone. Somewhere far above the clouds they are still diving or leveling out or searching for the American fighter that disappeared beneath them. But the target they expected to kill has already escaped. Johnson is alone again. Only now he is alive. He turns west. Toward England. Toward home. He checks his fuel. Enough. Barely. The flight back is quiet. The adrenaline slowly drains away. His hands continue to shake long after the danger is gone. When Johnson lands in England, he taxis to the edge of the airfield and shuts down the engine. The sudden silence inside the cockpit feels strange. He sits there for several minutes, staring at his hands. They are still trembling. During the debriefing, the intelligence officer asks him to describe the encounter. Johnson explains it simply. 5 enemy fighters. Vertical dive. Separation achieved. No kills. But no losses. The officer writes everything down without comment. At first, the story spreads through the squadron with skepticism. A vertical dive to escape enemy fighters? That is not a tactic. That is desperation. But Johnson is alive. And 5 German fighters failed to shoot him down. That fact is harder to ignore. A few pilots begin asking questions. How steep was the dive? How fast? How did you pull out? Johnson tries to explain. He talks about mass, inertia, and drag. Some pilots listen carefully. Others simply nod. They do not need to understand the math. They only need to know that it works. 3 days later, another pilot tries it. 2 Focke-Wulf fighters latch onto his tail. Instead of turning to fight, he rolls inverted and commits to a steep dive. The Thunderbolt accelerates. The German fighters cannot keep up. He escapes clean. When he lands, he can barely believe it. It worked. Word spreads. Not officially. The manuals do not change. Briefings still emphasize standard dogfighting tactics. But in the ready rooms and briefing huts, pilots begin sharing a new idea. If you are caught, if you are alone, if the enemy has altitude and numbers, do not turn, do not climb, Point the nose straight down and let gravity fight for you. The tactic saves lives. Not hundreds, not thousands, but enough. A pilot here, a wingman there. Men who would have died in turning fights instead return home with sweat-soaked flight suits and pounding hearts. All because someone trusted the math. Johnson himself uses the maneuver again. July, August, September. Every time he is outnumbered. Every time the geometry turns against him. He rolls inverted and dives. Every time he survives. By autumn, no one calls him classroom kid anymore. Now he is simply Johnson. Sometimes just Bob. Younger pilots ask him to explain the math. He sketches diagrams on maps and napkins. Some understand. Others simply trust that it works. The tactic spreads beyond the 56th Fighter Group. Other P-47 squadrons begin experimenting. Pilots across the 8th Air Force start comparing notes. The Thunderbolt may struggle in tight turning fights, but it dives like a meteor. So let it. Do not fight the enemy's fight. Fight physics. Even the Luftwaffe notices. German reports begin describing American fighters that suddenly plunge toward the ground at suicidal speeds instead of turning to fight. Some German pilots assume panic. Others recognize the pattern. Something new is happening. The maneuver does not win the war, but it changes the calculation. It turns a disadvantage into an option. It gives American pilots a way out when there should be none. And it all began because one quiet lieutenant from Oklahoma remembered a classroom demonstration. A marble and a wrench hitting the floor at the same time. By the end of the war, Robert S. Johnson has 27 confirmed victories, making him one of the leading American aces in Europe. He receives the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and numerous other decorations. But those are not the memories he writes about later. Years after the war, he describes the moment of the dive not as heroism, but as a struggle between fear and logic. His body screamed at him to pull up. His training told him the maneuver was insane. But the part of his mind that had once watched objects fall in a physics classroom told him to hold the stick forward. So he did, and the math was right. The vertical dive becomes a small footnote in fighter doctrine. It does not win dogfights. It does not produce dramatic gun camera victories. But it works. And in war, working is the same as surviving. After the war, Johnson returns to Oklahoma. He lives quietly. When people ask how he survived so many missions, he does not talk about courage or instinct. He talks about geometry, about angles, about trusting numbers even when every instinct tells you to stop. He dies in 1998 at the age of 78. By then, the Thunderbolt is a museum aircraft. The skies over Europe are peaceful, crossed by airliners whose passengers never think about dive angles or airspeed. They do not wonder how fast a 7-ton fighter falls. But the lesson remains. Sometimes survival is not about fighting harder. Sometimes it is about thinking more clearly. Sometimes the bravest thing a pilot can do is trust something invisible. Robert Johnson trusted it. He fell toward the earth at nearly 500 miles per hour. And the earth let him pull away. Not because he was lucky, because he was right. And in a war where almost nothing made sense, being right once was enough to change the outcome.